Check, check. Hello and welcome to Bodies of Truth, Personal Narratives on Illness, Disability, and Medicine. My name is Ryan Clackum. I'm the director of the West Virginia Humanities Center, and I'm really thrilled to be doing an event that crosses over. A quick little narrative that last summer I was at new faculty orientation, and the faculty at Health Sciences is growing. And so as I was staffing a table, I was thinking, I would catch the one or two traditional humanities faculty. And meanwhile, doctors are crossing my path and saying, oh, the Humanities Center, are we talking about medical humanities? And I was thrilled to be able to say, wait for January, and we have a really exciting event. This event is our first spring event in our Quality of Life speaker series. we're really sort of focused on the idea of connecting the work that happens in the humanities as it impacts and informs our understanding of what it means to live a good life and live a better life. And in some ways, this event is one of our most sort of spot-on events in sort of thinking about how humanities and arts approaches to medicine and health really do understand not just how do we live longer, but also how we live better. And so I'm thrilled to be welcoming our 4 panelists today, 3 editors and a contributor to the volume Bodies of Truth, which is on sale with some of our contributors' other volumes out in the lobby after the event. First, we have Erin Murphy, who is the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently Assisted Living, a collection of demi-sonnets that focus on the life cycle and end-of-life issues. She is co-editor of 2 anthologies from SUNY Press, Creating Nonfiction, 20 Essays and Interviews with the Writers, winner of the Forward Indies Book of the Year Award, and also Making Poems, 40 Poems with Commentary by the Poets. Her work has been featured on the Writer's Almanac, and her poems and essays have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including the Yale Journal for Humanities and Medicine, the Georgia Review, Field, Brevity, Women's Studies Quarterly, and elsewhere. She is professor of English and creative writing at the Pennsylvania State University Altoona College and has served as the Medical Humanities Discussion Group facilitator for UPMC Hospital in Altoona. Yes. Please also welcome Dinty W. Moore, who has published numerous writing craft books and edited various anthologies, currently used in creative writing classrooms, including Crafting the Personal Essay, a guide for writing and publishing creative nonfiction, and the Rose Medal Press Guide to Writing Flash Nonfiction. His memoir, Between Panic and Desire, was winner of the Grub Street Nonfiction Book Prize in 2009, and other books include The Mindful Writer, The Accidental Buddhist, and Dear Mr. Essay Writer Guy, which is maybe my favorite of his. Moore has published essays and stories in the Southern Review, the Georgia Review, Harper's, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, the Philadelphia Inquirer Magazine, Gettysburg Review, Utne Reader, and Crazy Horse, among numerous other venues. He edits Brevity, the Journal of Concise Literary Nonfiction, and directs the MA and PhD in creative writing at Ohio University. Renee Nicholson, our own Renee Nicholson, and many of you probably know Renee, is a past emerging writer in residence at Penn State Altoona. Wonder where that contact emerged, and is author of Roundabout Directions to Lincoln Center. She's an assistant professor in programs for multi and interdisciplinary studies here at West Virginia University. She worked in the WVU Cancer Institute and a Benedum Foundation and West Virginia Clinical and Translational Institute grant-funded pilot study of expressive writing with patients receiving chemotherapy. And I'm also really proud to say that the Humanities Center is funding a next step in that research in working with Dr. Allison Lastinger and Professor Stacy Culp on work with the infectious disease practice as well. Her writing has appeared in Poets and Writers, Midwestern Gothic, Moon City Review, the Los Angeles Review, the Superstition Review, Leadership in the Humanities, the Gettysburg Review, and elsewhere. And she's received a WVU advanced grant as well as a grant from the West Virginia Commission on the Arts. She co-founded and edits prose for the journal Souvenir and has completed the basic and advanced workshops in narrative medicine at Columbia University's School of Medicine. And she collaborates regularly with healthcare professionals in the Morgantown area on medical humanities projects. And finally, Dr. Matthew S. Smith is assistant professor in West Virginia University School of Medicine's Department of Neurology and director here of Neurocritical Care. His board certifications include American Board of Internal Medicine, and American Board of Psychology and Neurology. So please welcome our panelists. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for coming to hear us talk today. It's a pleasure to see so many turn out on a kind of blustery winter afternoon. What I wanted to give you a little idea of what we're going to do. There's a program, but to be a little more explicit, each of us are going to give an overview about a different aspect of our book project, Bodies of Truth. And then we're each going to share an excerpt from a different contributor's essay. In between there, Dr. Smith is going to read his contribution, which is a fantastic essay that we're thrilled to be able to include in our book. So I want to tell you a little bit about the origins of this book project. As Ryan mentioned, I was the facilitator for a medical humanities discussion group at UPMC Altoona. And I was asked to lead this discussion group. And there were resident physicians, there were longtime physicians who were involved, there were faculty involved as well. And I didn't select the books. The organizer was an avid reader, a family physician, and she picked the books, and they were outstanding novels and nonfiction books, but they were all about 300 to 500 pages long. And what we found was that most of the residents who were there just did not have time to read those books. So we would show up for these discussions, and we were lucky if they had read the first 10 pages, and maybe they were doing that on a coffee break, in between. And I became very aware of how precious time was to them when we would enter the hospital through the staff entrance in the back. And in the entryway, there were 3 vending machines. All 3 vending machines were stocked top to bottom with a single item, 5-hour energy drink. And I realized time is so precious for all of these healthcare professionals, and they're trying to maximize it, with their 5-hour energy. We can't ask them to read 300 to 500 page books. We need pieces that are shorter, that are kind of more bite-sized, more manageable. We did manage to have very productive and interesting conversations anyway. As a faculty member in the humanities, I have to say I'm pretty adept at walking into classrooms where students haven't done the reading. You figure out ways to work around that. I remember one discussion in particular that was so interesting. The longtime physicians and the younger doctors were all debating the importance of listening to a patient's heartbeat with a stethoscope. And the older physicians were saying it was absolutely crucial to do this. It was so important in terms of establishing rapport with your patients, establishing a kind of intimacy with them, to take that moment and listen to their heartbeat. The younger physicians were saying, oh, but that data is so unreliable, it leads to false positives. And watching them hash it out and debate, it was like watching a tennis match, going back and forth. And I realized that what we really needed were some kind of shorter pieces that addressed a lot of these issues, things that they could read in their entirety, and that we could talk about in the time that was allotted, in between when their beepers were going off and they were running off to deal with emergencies. So that's where the idea for this book project came about. I liked the idea of having different health conditions, different perspectives from the healthcare field, and also just having shorter pieces, anywhere from, say, 3 to 15 pages or so, that people could read quickly. So I thought I'd love to have a couple of co-editors with this, and I thought of the best writers and editors that I knew, and selfishly of a couple of people that I'd really enjoy working with for a few years on this project. And I reached out to Renee and Dinty, and I was very happy that they agreed to work with on this project with me. So I thought I would share the preface. Actually, it's just a little excerpt from the preface of our book. All of us have been or will be touched by illness or disability at some point in our lives. It may be our own condition or that of a loved one. Whether considering one author's dehumanizing tests to prove his neurological disability, which Dinty will be sharing part of that essay, or another author's experience with infertility, readers will be able to relate to the challenges, frustrations, and pain, both physical and emotional, that these writers have experienced. The contributors are patients, nurses, doctors, parents, children, caregivers, and others touched by illness, disability, and medicine. Among the subjects addressed are cancer, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, severe food allergies, death of a child, Down syndrome, autoimmune disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, depression, PTSD, and others. In addition to relating to patients, readers will also be able to empathize with healthcare providers, from navigating the most basic interactions with patients, such as a handshake, to the challenges of staying current with pharmaceutical advances. Contributors in healthcare fields take us behind the curtain of their professional worlds. Medicine still contains an oral tradition passed down in stories, the stories patients tell us, the ones we tell them, and the ones we tell ourselves, writes Madeline Harrison, professor and neurologist, in her essay, Days of the Giants. We hope to contribute to this tradition with bodies of truth, personal narratives on illness, disability, and medicine. And so now I'll turn it over to Dinty Moore, who will add another perspective on this project.
Let me repeat how nice it was to be invited by the Humanities Center, how nice it is for you to brave the blustery snow and come hear us, and how absolutely wonderful it was to work with the people here on stage. I've been tasked with changing my glasses so I can actually read. I've been tasked with talking about the types of essays that we brought into the book. And we did read an enormous number we reached out to people we knew who were writers. We put a call out, we read a lot of essays, and it was important to us to try to get the widest range of experience, both obviously those who are struggling with sickness and ill health, but the caregivers at all levels, physicians, NICU nurse, and sometimes the caregiver is the parent or the spouse, and people from various ends of the medical community and the medical effort. So I thought, rather than, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just give you the table of contents with a little bit of added material, and hope that you get a good sense of what the book entails and includes. The book begins with an essay called Two Hearts, where Brian Doyle writes of his twin sons, Joe and Liam. Joseph has a whole heart, Brian Doyle tells us. Liam has half. Next is an essay entitled Spared. A mother offers an intimate account of the genetic illness that claimed her mother and sister, bypassed her, but seems to be skipping a generation and threatening the health of her daughter. Floyd Skloot, in his essay A Measure of Acceptance, which I'll read a small portion of in a few moments, talks about living with brain injury, negotiating medicine and physical therapy, and fighting with those who determine the definition of disability. Dr. Matt Smith is here. I'll let you learn from yourself about his wonderful essay. That's followed by an essay chronicling time spent in a psychiatric facility due to severe depression, followed by an essay on the experience of deafness and the choice, controversial to some, to have children, risking that the deafness will be passed on. Michael Barabay writes about parenting and advocating for his son with Down syndrome and the transition from dependent child to independent adult. Sonia Huber writes about life with chronic pain. William Bradley offers us the idea of reading the body as a narrative of illness and injury. First, the scars left by childhood mishaps and bicycle accidents, then his many biopsy scars, and finally the thin line of tattooed blue dots running down his chest that serves as a map to guide his radiation therapy. Bradley's essay is followed by one titled 750 Words About Cancer, which I think speaks for itself. And then a brief nonfiction piece provided by Dr. Hugh Silk, who writes about his experiences working in correctional health, seeing to the needs of inmates and the importance of connecting, physically connecting, through a handshake, through a stethoscope exam with the patients he treats. A former Coast Guard diver, suffering PTSD from both the diving and her rough treatment by her Coast Guard superiors, shares the story of backpacking with her therapy dog, Elu, as a way of reclaiming her life, her sanity, and her connection to her own body. Then a young woman struggles with multiple addictions in rehab and the inadequacy of the medical care she is offered, and the hopelessness that continuously drives her back to the habit she knows can kill her. Next, a riveting and difficult look inside a neonatal intensive care unit from the perspective of a nurse who works there. Adriana Paramo writes about the pain of seeing a teenage daughter battling suicidal thoughts and actions. Another mother writes about the death of her 9-year-old son to sepsis. Then an essay by a certified music practitioner who plays Celtic harp in hospitals, nursing homes, and hospice, and the restorative power of therapeutic music. A man who has lived with HIV for 30 plus years examines the stigma, the privilege of insurance and access, and what it is like living for 3 decades with a life-changing illness. Riley Passmore remembers wasting away from untreated diabetes at age 16 and facing an imagined death. Another story looks at life with multiple food allergies, the history of the EpiPen, medical research and advocacy, and as the author, Sandra Beasley, puts it, having to constantly weigh the risk of dying against the needs of living. Another physician writes a letter to a pharmacist acknowledging the critical and often overlooked role that pharmacists play in patient care. Nearer the end of the book, an essay on negotiating rheumatoid arthritis and the possibility of pregnancy, and eventually coming to terms with the fact that the author's body cannot stand the strain of pregnancy and birth. Erin Kelly, who Erin Murphy and I both had the privilege of knowing during our undergraduate years, gives us a glimpse of the day-to-day challenge of living with cerebral palsy. Belinda Waller-Peterson, both a registered nurse and a professor of African American literature, interviews her mother to give us an illness narrative about the experience of living with severe asthma and the refusal of friends and coworkers to acknowledge the severity of her illness. And finally, Madeline Harrison, a neurologist at the University of Virginia, closes the book with a consideration of the importance of story in medicine, how stories, and I'm quoting her now, and I think Erin quoted her a bit too, but she's worth quoting again, how stories pass down and changed by each teller as the times change, that link the legendary physicians of the past to the students and residents standing beside me at the door of the next room, where another story is unfolding. I step inside, she says, uncertain what challenge I will find and whether I will be equal to it. I ready myself to listen. The story begins, and I hope for the heart to see it through. All of these short and shorter and somewhat medium-sized bits of writing fall under the term that we now call creative nonfiction, which is really just a fancy word for telling true stories in a compelling fashion. And they are compelling. To me, and I teach creative nonfiction all the time, what's important about this genre are 2 things, information and empathy. And the essays we hear, the essays we have in the book, give a lot of information. I mean, reading to decide what was in the book, editing those pieces that are in the book, and then rereading the book this week to prepare to talk today. I learned so much about all aspects of medicine and obviously from all sides of the equation. It also gives me an appreciation for the struggling on all sides. We know that people with illness and disability and fatal disease, struggle greatly all the time with all kinds of challenges, but the struggle of the good caretakers trying, whether they're the parents, whether they're the spouses, whether they're nurses, doctors, pharmacists, music therapists, the struggles that they face. That's the empathy part of it that I find is the cumulative effect of reading the book. There are good people out there and people who care, and that's who you find in the pages of the book. And I'm proud to have been part of the process. Thank you. Renee.
So when Erin asked me if I wanted to work on this book with herself and Dinty, it was sort of the way I would imagine baseball players feel like when they're in the minor leagues and they get called up to the majors. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about how the book will be used, and that will probably not be a surprise to many people in here, since I'm always like, yeah, but what are we going to do with it? So we'll talk a little bit. So Sonia Huber starts her piece off, if pain is a language, I have an accent on my tongue, right? So here we're thinking about medicine, we're thinking about illness, we're thinking about disability, and we're getting to it in language, right? But language, as many of you know, and those of you who have taken classes with me or done projects with me, can be a sticky thing. It's a very sticky widget. Yes, and so how do we get in here? How do we do something with this? Erin talked about her experience in the hospitals around Altoona and working with doctors and time being an issue. And having sat in several different clinics now, time is definitely an issue, right? That most of the doctors are squeezing in a lot of other things before and after their actual rounds. That our insurance companies are saying that it makes sense for you to get 15 minutes of their time on a good day if they're not running behind. And those of you who practice, tell me what day that is, right? And for no fault of anyone's, right? Time is this fixed asset that we all only have so much of. So as I think about how to use this book, I first think about who should use this book, right? And I think about my pre-medical students, looking out at my former student, Lindsay, who has been accepted to medical school. We should give her a hand for that. That's a hard thing, right? Who didn't go to another university, not this one, but another one in the state that shall not be mentioned because they didn't want her to study both biology and minor in oboe. This book's for you, right? And I think about medical students, and I think I see my former student, Sarah Brzezinski, there in the back, and she was a bio major and an English major, and she really doesn't want to give up writing poems, and she shouldn't, but she's also, in cadaver lab right now, and she needs to be there too, right? She doesn't have time for the 500-page novel, but she probably has time for a 2 or 3 page essay. Sarah, this book is for you, right? And as I look around, I see my friend Jack Riggs, who's a distinguished professor of neurology, right? And he writes these very funny pieces about being in the Navy, and maybe he wants to read what other doctors write. And I think this book is for you, which is to say this book is for a very wide range of people. Now, how do you do something with that wide range of people? And I would say this. Think of it as like a one book club where you can go in essay by essay and just spend time with that voice, right? And then I was thinking about my training way back in the 90s with a writer named Susan Neville, and she was crazy about point of view, and as it turns out, so am I. And she used to give us this list, and I think the list comes from Janet Burroway, and it is who speaks, to whom, in what form, at what distance, with what limitations. And if you went through and just read every essay in this book and thought about those questions, your understanding of humanity would triple isn't even right, like quadruple times 10 times infinity, right? That these are the essential questions that happen to us not only in medicine, but in life. But let's get more specific than that, because I like specifics. So they're going to share some essays with you later, but I'm going to jump in and do mine now. I've had the chance to get to work with Dr. Rita Sharon at Columbia University, and this is a woman who blows my mind because not only is she a general internist who did her medical education at Harvard, but then while she was an internist at Columbia, she just sort of picked up a PhD in literature, because, as you do when you're a doctor, and studied Henry James of all people. That was the area of her dissertation. And she was realizing the clinical relevance of all this thing she was learning about narrative, right? And so she started the practice of narrative medicine. So if you're in a workshop with Rita, the first thing she does is she gives you a chunk of text. So I'm going to give you a chunk of text, and this is from a doctor named Taysom Bell, and he has an essay in our collection called "A Tribute to the Pharmacist." Dear pharmacist, you just paged me, and I must admit I'm not feeling excited to call back. I estimate I probably get paged, called, texted, or stopped in person by you exactly X times 10 to the second power per day, where X is the number of days I've been on service. Despite all the interactions over the years, I have never stopped to really consider our relationship. I could stop there for a minute. Right there, if I gave that chunk of text, and many of my students in the audience would know I would do this, I'd say, write about a time when you had to explain a complicated relationship, right? Because it turns out Dr. Bell has a problem with what he's prescribed a patient. This never happens, right? You once paged me while I was working in the ICU. I was admitting a patient to the unit in wide open septic shock and multi-organ failure. In fact, I had just finished intubating, placing 2 central lines, placing an arterial line, and writing dialysis orders, all in just 1.5 hours. I love how specific he is about the hours, about the time, right? I was fist bumping the nurses and feeling on top of the world. And just as my head was expanding with a rare moment to stroke my ego, I received your page. You reminded me that despite being the day's procedure king / line master, this awesomeness didn't prevent me from ordering the wrong diluent for the vasopressin. I hope I said that right. You asked if I could kindly reorder it so that the patient could, while I'm celebrating, actually have a blood pressure that was compatible with life. During our history, you've been able to refocus my energy and avert errors multiple times. You gotta love his humor, right? You gotta, also admire his hubris, right? And if I were working with a group of residents, which I will be in a couple weeks, I'd say, write about a time someone saved you from making a mistake, right? Because those are all the questions, whether we're in medicine or not, that we can relate to, right? Medicine is as we are in life often. So there's a little bit of the how I would use it and a little bit of the who I would use it with. But I would also argue that the book serves another purpose. And that purpose is to create community. If you've just been diagnosed with something, you feel alone. And maybe you find in the pages of this book somebody who's gone through what you've gone through, and you don't feel so alone. Or maybe you're a doctor and you ordered the wrong medication and you feel bad. And you read Taste and Bell and you realize everybody does that. And oh, by the way, interprofessional connections are really important, right? We talk a lot in medicine about interprofessional development, right? But I think something also happens with a book like this that creates community. The people who read it, just like the book clubs that get together and read whole books, form bonds with each other. They understand each other differently when they speak aloud about it. And probably somehow the contributors of this book are somehow connected to the other contributors. And this happened to me on another anthology. This one happened to be of West Virginia writers of poetry and fiction. That all of a sudden I was like, I have found my tribe, and these are my people. So I would argue those are just some of the ways, and I hope that in our Q&A we'll bring up others. So I'm going to turn over to Matt.
So I'm going to read my short piece. One Little Mind, Our Lie, Dr. Lie. Medicine, like life, is made up of moments. Their significance may not be apparent while you are living them, but become clear when recalled through the fog of memory. Here is a moment that haunts me, making me wish I had done things differently, recording, storing, and enjoying its significance. I was a neurology resident on call. I'm not sure of the year. I remember it was late. I'd worked close to 24 hours, and without warning, one of the aphasics darted out of her room to accost me with a piece of paper. I was stunned by her sudden attack, but too tired to attempt defense. She thrust the folded sheet of paper in my hand before disappearing into the darkness of her room, shutting the door behind her. I put the paper in my pocket to read later, not knowing what I might find. Maybe it was youth or hubris, but I don't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to get home and sleep. I had done my duty, admitting and keeping the patients alive for one more night while everyone else slumbered. I placed it in my pocket to later be deposited in the pile of detritus, of partially read journal articles, bills, and important, but yet unfiled papers. It was one of those moments when you're searching for something else, and you stumble upon a memory that makes you forget the original errand. Maybe I was in a more introspective state. Maybe I'd been reading too much Oliver Sacks or V.S. Ramachandran. I unfolded the as yet unread letter from years before and found the following. Dr. Lie, they a bottle, is I hospital. I'm the Vicodin. Lie, answer numbers. They pain our pills, they eyes. They pains wrote angry, I wrote. The pills as easy, Dr. Lie as lawyer, as lie as. I needy, not doctor, lawyer, every. Please, are you doing she, is mind, everyone little lie, you everyone. One little mind, our lie, help, minds. I was struck by the poetry and rhythm of the letter. She was like the patient Sachs talks about in the president's speech in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, with the feeling tone of Henry Head and certainly not like the dogs of Feeling Jackson. She had lost her grammatical voice, but had found a new one, a voice that was able to convey the confusion and frustration perhaps better than the typical essayist could, with her right brain now free to express her feeling in a poetic way. I don't know what happened to this latent poet. She was lost to me the moment I left the ward, not even knowing who she was other than left MCA stroke with expressive aphasia. Her framed letter lives on in my office as a reminder of the mysteries of communication and as an admonition to cherish the moments of practice, because there are so many poignant moments and you never know which of them will change your life forever.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to share an excerpt from the essay Overtones by Meredith Davies Haddaway, who is an award-winning poet who lives on the eastern shore of Maryland. She plays the harp, and she uses the harp for therapeutic music in various settings. Overtones. Would you like some music? The nurse asks her patient while I stand with my harp in the doorway of his hospital room. It don't matter, says the boy. All elbows and angles he shifts in the sheets. Pain and fever have made him sweaty and bright. Hair the color of autumn soybeans sticks out from his temples in little peaks. He doesn't speak but slowly turns to face me, one arm braceleted in yellow that says fall risk. I wheel the harp into the room, sit on a small folding stool I have carried with me, and begin to weave through a series of notes. I play longer, sweeter, slower, hoping he will sleep. His eyes stay open, but his feet stop jigging under mounds of white. On the tray between us, I see the slight shiver of water in its cup. The first time I played music for someone in medical distress, it was my husband who was dying of lung cancer in our living room. He had been too weak to turn himself, yet he leapt off the hospital bed we had placed in the window by the river. He was extremely agitated. Even back in bed, he twisted and shuddered. In order to calm my own anxieties and with some vague notion it might help his, I placed a CD in the player, a CD by Eric Satie. The slow, steady pulse and spare harmonies filled the room like a breathing presence. Within a few minutes, my fear was gone and I felt a palpable peace settle between us. By my side, my husband's eyes closed and his breathing was slow but more regular. The agitation was replaced by utter repose. His facial muscles were relaxed, but not slack. His arms lay gently by his side. We breathed together in that space for what seemed a long time, though by now the minutes slipped by unnoticed. The music played on thanks to the repeat button on the player, an otherworldly soundtrack for the breaths that now slowed to a pace I could not match. Long pauses, longer pauses. Eventually, only the strands of Satie's strange chords floated bodily in the air around us. Years later, I'm wheeling my 34-string Celtic harp across the parking lot of a nearby residential hospice facility. Partly because I want to pay it forward in honor of my husband, and partly because I thought I could use a little healing myself, I have enrolled in the Music for Healing and Transition Program, MHTP, to become a Certified Music Practitioner, CMP. MHTP is one of several programs that offer training in therapeutic music, which the literature describes as live acoustic music played or sung, specifically tailored to an individual patient's immediate need in order to bring music's intrinsic healing properties to the bedside. Often the session starts at 50 to 70 beats per minute, echoing resting human heartbeat, and slows gradually to induce sleep or relaxation. Entrainment is how we describe music's ability to change the physiological responses of those in the room. Heartbeat slowing with the music's pulse, respiration matching the musical phrase. My role is to inhabit the shared space of the music with those in the room, be they conscious or unconscious, patient or family member. This differs from entertainment, where the content of music might dictate tempo and selection. For nursing home patients, we try to play recognizable tunes, hoping familiarity will enhance a sense of identity and stability. For premature babies, we play lullabies that sway in 3/4 time, often in the higher registers, more like a mother's voice. The music we play for those who are actively dying tends to be arrhythmic or very loosely metered, matching the patient's inhalations and exhalations rather than heartbeat. At the end of life, the goal is to help the patient let go, so we avoid the distraction of earthly melodies. The more obvious significance of live versus recorded music is the connection that occurs when another human is present, whether a nurse, a priest, a hospice volunteer, a loved one, or simply a stranger with a harp. Whatever vibrations emanate from the harp strings, they are part of a less predictable set of overtones, which is the emotional energy of another human presence, providing awareness, whether conscious, semi-conscious, subliminal, or via some more mysterious means, that we are not alone in our struggle, in our illnesses, in our aging, in our various and even final transitions. In the hospital room, the boy who told me it don't matter tugs at his covers with the large reddened hands of a farm worker and settles back into the pillow. Seated across from him, I pluck at strings with the small, waning fingers of a 60-year-old woman. You should make a CD, he finally says, so people know you're out there. I'm not out there, I say. I'm here. Thanks.
And I'm going to read just a small portion of an essay by Floyd Skloot. Floyd is a poet and a novelist and an essayist, other than the work he gave us for the Bodies of Truth. He's been included in Best American Essays, Best American Science Writing, Best Spiritual Writing, and Best Food Writing. He's an amazing man, an amazing writer. But in 1988, Floyd contracted a virus that attacked his brain, and his essay, A Measure of Acceptance, which I'm reading just a bit of, talks about that experience, the experience of living after this. Now, 12 years after first getting sick, I've become adept at being brain damaged. It's not that my symptoms have gone away. I still try to dice a stalk of celery with a carrot instead of a knife, still reverse P and B when I write, or draw a primitive hourglass when I mean to draw a star. I call out bird feeder. I call our bird feeder a breadwinner and place newly purchased packages of frozen corn in the dishwasher instead of the freezer. I put crumpled newspaper and dry pine into our wood stove, strike a match, and attempt to light the metal door. Preparing to cross the main street in Carlton, Oregon, I looked both ways, saw a pickup truck a 1/4 mile south, took one step off the curb, and landed flat on my face. So I'm still much as I was in December of 1988 when I first got sick. I spent most of a year confined to bed. I couldn't write and had trouble reading anything more complicated than People magazine or the newspaper's sports page. The functioning of memory was shattered, bits of the past clumped like a partly assembled jigsaw puzzle, the present a flicker of discontinuous images. Without memory, it was impossible for me to learn how to operate the new music system that was meant to help me pass the time, or figure out why I felt so confused, or even take my medications without support. But in time, I learned to manage my encounters with the world in new ways. I shed what no longer fit the life: training shoes and road racing flats, three-piece suits and ties, a car. I bought a cane. I seated my home with pads and pens so that I could write reminders before forgetting what I'd thought. I festooned my room with color-coded Post-it notes, telling me what to do, whom to call, where to locate important items. I remarried, finding love when I imagined it no longer possible. Eventually, I moved to the country, slowing my external life to match its internal pace, simplifying, stripping away layers of distraction and demands. Expecting the unexpected now, I can, like an improvisational actor, incorporate it into my performance. For instance, my tendency to use words that are close to, but not exactly, the words I'm trying to say has led me to some surprising discoveries in the composition of sentences. A freshness emerges when the mind is unshackled from its habitual ways. In the past, I never would have described the effect of a viral attack on my brain as being geezered overnight if I hadn't first confused the words seizure and geezer. It is as though my word-finding capacity has developed an associative function to compensate for its failures of precision. So I end up with shellac instead of plaque when trying to describe the gunk on my teeth. Who knows, maybe James Joyce was brain damaged when he wrote Finnegan's Wake and built a whole novel on puns and neologisms that were actually symptoms of his disease. It's possible to see such domination of the unexpected in a positive light. So getting lost in the familiar woods around our house and finding my way home again adds a twist of excitement to days that might seem circumscribed or routine because of my disability. When the natural food grocery where we shop rearranged its entire stock, I was one of the few customers who didn't mind, since I could never even remember where things were. I am less hurried and more deliberate than I was. Being attentive, purposeful in movement, lends my life an intensity of awareness that was not always present before. My senses are heightened, their fine-tuning mechanism busted. Spicy food, stargazer lilies in bloom, birdsong heat, my wife's vivid palette when she paints, have all become more intense and stimulating. Because it threatens my balance, a sudden breeze is something to stop for, to let its strength and motion register. One way of spinning this is to say that my daily experience is often spontaneous and exciting, not fragmented and intimidating, but unpredictable, continuously new. I may lose track of things, or of myself in space, my line of thought, but instead of getting frustrated, I try to see this as the perfect time to stop and figure out what I want or where I am. I accept my role in the Harlequinade. It's not so much a matter of making lemonade out of life's lemons, but rather of learning to savor the shock, taste, texture, and after effects of a mouthful of unadulterated citrus. Thank you.
So I guess this is the part where we stare awkwardly at each other until someone decides, I have a question. There are microphones. Should you have a question?
But if you have a good voice, you can just shout and
Lindsay.
little bit of all of the above. I mean, I was familiar with Floyd Skloot's writing. I think all of us up here were maybe, because he is a very prolific and accomplished writer. So when we had the idea for the book, we thought, boy, we should ask Floyd Skloot if he has something to share with us. In some cases, one of us knew the author. In some cases, we went out looking for people, and total strangers offered us work that we ended up putting in the book.
Or sometimes we had a particular condition that we wanted to make sure was represented. And so we would search in different journals until we found a piece that we thought could work. And then we would reach out to the author for that.
So I'll tell you two funny anecdotes about this, because I know you, Lindsay, and you're going to want the funny stuff. So the first one is about Matt Smith. And Matt Smith actually Googled WVU and narrative medicine. And he wrote me an email that says, when you Google WVU and narrative medicine, your name pops up. And that's how we got to know each other. And I got to read early versions of the essay that he read you. And I was like, wow, this is good. And I was like, you're such a slacker. You didn't even go to medical school. Here's a guy doing creative writing who's a neurologist. So the second one was I read a lot of medical things now, and there's a website called Kevin MD. And I read it pretty regularly. My friend Dr. Sikora has a former student who writes for it a lot, and I always try to read his name's Ed Leap, and I try to read his pieces. And one day I was reading it, and there was this funny thing, and it starts out, "Dear Pharmacist," right? And it was the first time I was sitting reading Kevin MD, like cracking up. So I sent it to Tinty and Erin, and I said, I don't know about this, but I really liked it. And then they really liked it too and liked the humor, but none of us knew him. And I'm like, that's not going to stop me. We're just going to have to be friends now. So I totally reached out to him. I'm like, you don't know me. I'm working on this thing. Can we use your essay? And he's like, yeah, you can.
Any other questions?
Comments?
If you wonder how we all got to be so good looking, we could talk about that.
I have a question. What I'd like to know is from the editors and the version of the same question for Dr. Smith, which is that as you've been doing these various projects, medical practice editing, what would you say is the most sort of surprising connection that you've discovered between language and the human body?
Just answer this first.
Yeah, what do you think, Matt? You got a good one?
So it's an interesting question. So I got interested in literary medicine realistically because most of what we do is doesn't last very long. Most of the things are cutting edge and state of the art. 10, 20 years from now, we'll find out everything I'm doing now in my practice is all wrong. And the new medical students coming through at that point in my career will laugh at me and say, oh, you used to do that. Isn't that funny? But the literary things and how people interact are very much more permanent. I mean, when we talk about classical literature, we talk about it because the things they were talking about thousands of years ago still apply. People, interactions and things that we do are much more permanent. And it's much more of an important part of being a physician than a lot of the medical knowledge. My day-to-day practice is more dictated with the social interactions that are couched in medical science. The second part of it is the fact that I went into neurology because I was fascinated with the idea of how we communicate. So like my essay is on aphasia and how if you lose your ability to communicate, what happens to the voice in your head? Do you lose your consciousness? And unfortunately, folks with these conditions can't tell us. So you're sort of left with a person that can look at you and is certainly awake and alert and doing things, but can't communicate what's going on inside of them. This is always sort of another fascinating part of this whole thing.
That's a wonderful essay, by the way, and the poem that you structured it around. This is kind of untitled. Well, What I always find myself explaining to people who aren't writers is there's all these things in life where we say, you had to be there. Oh, you can't understand it unless it happens to you. There's no way to put it into words. And we're allowed to say that, unless you're a writer. And then you have to figure out a way, not only to put it into words, but to have this person and this person and this person and this person feel what it's like to live with rheumatoid arthritis, feel what it's like to have a row of dots tattooed down your chest for the radiation therapist to know how to apply the medicine, feel what it's like to be a NICU nurse. So, I mean, that language and the experience of living, maybe not necessarily the body, but the experience of living, that's the connection that I find so fascinating, is how people use language to, and these things aren't necessarily about language. Illness is not about language, but they find a way with words to help me understand in a way that in many cases I hope I never have to, because these illnesses that befall people, but it hasn't happened to me yet. I'm going to get sick, I'm going to get old, I'm going to die. It hasn't happened to me yet, but it's fascinating to understand it in a way that language allows me to do.
And I think narrative, it's important for expression, but it's also important for empowerment. And especially in the case of patients, to be able to express what it is that you're experiencing in the form of a narrative, to turn it into a story, gives you a kind of power over it. It's not just happening to you. You're helping to frame and create that. I think, was it Betsy that I met earlier? Where's Betsy? And Betsy's husband worked with Renee on a memoir about his experiences, and maybe Renee could talk a little bit more about that. But it sounded like that must have been very empowering for him at the end of life to be working on that project. And it was also a real gift for his loved ones and family members too. Do you want to talk about that project?
Yeah, I will, but I'm going to preface it by bringing up something from class. Hi, class. I see you all. Thank you. So we talked about, if they're here, you should acknowledge students are here, right? So we read, he's super famous. You're going to leave here and say, I'm a famous person. He's the essay writer guy, which Mr. Rest, and when it's funny because at the Cancer Institute, I was funny little poetry lady. So I think we got a shtick. We read an essay about the medical humanities, and in it, the author says, we are bodies, but we are also what lives in bodies, right? And to communicate what it is to live in a body takes language, right? See, I told you that essay was going to tie in today. I told you, right? But to the memoir with Jamie Shumway, and I didn't know what palliative care was until a palliative care doctor called me and said the most remarkable sentence of my entire life: I need a creative writer. I had never heard that before or since. It was an awesome moment. Jamie was a man who had lived a very full life. He was the Associate Dean of Medical Education. He was an avid outdoorsman. He whitewater boated. He was a climber. He was fishing. If it was out of doors, he was into it. He helped found the West Virginia Rivers Coalition. He helped pass legislation that made the Bluestone River, parts of the Bluestone River, scenic. He was a world traveler. He was just a cool guy. He saw the Who in California before anybody knew who the Who was. That's how cool Jamie Shumway was. Yes. And when I met with him, I said, I totally don't know what I'm doing, but I want to meet him. I want to see if I can help, because I was compelled by this. And when I met him, he couldn't move he couldn't move his arms or his legs. He was in this mechanized wheelchair, and it had this joystick, and he could press it. And you'd think he'd be really slow getting around, but he maneuvered that thing with the precision and speed of an IndyCar driver. And he said he had sat with friends and family and told stories. He had them transcribed. There were over 500 pages of his transcript So I said, well, you have all your stories. And he looked at me like I was nuts. And he's like, Renee, nobody wants to read a transcript. And after reading those 500 and some pages, I totally get where he was going, right? Because he said, the importance of this story, of these stories, is I want to tell them in my own voice. And then I had this, like, talk about a cool writing challenge. I had to write with someone their memoir, but not my memoir, not my words, not the choices I would make. I had to guide them through the process. I had to shape a voice on the page that was not my own, right? And even in fiction, like, that's the person you created. Like, I didn't create Jamie, right? So this was an interesting writing challenge. The more I think about it, I was like, man, he taught me everything I know about voice and then some, right? But what happened as a result when we would sit together is he had this infectious smile, and he would smile, and he would not think about the fact that he was in a wheelchair. He would be back in Oman or Scotland. He would be on the Yakagani River. He would be other places, right? And for those moments, I think he escaped where he was, and he said the only other place that he felt that way was dreaming. And I was like, well, that's cool. That's the power of writing right there. So, and maybe the most miraculous thing that has ever happened to me as a writer is the day that I found out the project with him was over and the project with his wife Betsy has started. So Jamie had been asking her and others to read him. He wanted to hear the memoir top to bottom. We had 200 and some pages together. We had a full manuscript. He wanted it to hear it out loud. Jamie died at home peacefully with his family. He'd had a good, great day with his son, and he finished the memoir. And when Betsy finished reading it to him, not long after, he passed away. And I thought, oh my God, that's why this is important, right? So I think I probably think about that, if not every day, several times a week. That's what writing does. So thank you for prompting that, Erin. And thank you. Betsy's here, and she and I spent a long time editing and getting it cleaned up so it was ready to put into print and put into the hands of his friends and his loved ones. And that was a cool process too. But that'll be another talk, another time.
In case you can't hear him in the back, he said it's a good book.
He said, didn't
I
he
think he
say
means it.
everyone should read it?
Yeah.
I think he said everyone. Yeah. So the question is, if you're teaching this book, what do you want your students, whether they're English majors, pre-med, medical students, what do you want them to take from the book? What do you guys think?
Just real quickly, one of the hardest things to teach, I teach both fiction and nonfiction, is how do you make someone who's real in your head real on the page? So the reader who's never met this person, if they're real, or has never met this person if they're fictional, experience as a human being. And that's one thing this book accomplishes. The writing's really good, but I think also the subject matter is so important and focused that you can really learn a lot about people and how to have people become alive on the page through this book.
I think also when you're thinking of people who are going into healthcare professions, which I have a daughter who's doing that now, to think about things from other points of view that you wouldn't necessarily consider. So if you're the provider thinking about the patient, even sometimes if you're the patient thinking about the provider's perspective, I think so often, and especially now with our own sort of silos of information that we live in, you don't get outside of your own experience. And I think that's so important, especially when you're treating others or working with others one-on-one like that. And I think the book gives you a lot of different scenarios to picture yourself in somebody else's shoes and to think about some ethical and other issues, to think about how you might handle it, or maybe if you're a longtime practitioner, to think about how you have handled things and maybe how you might handle them differently in the future. So I think it helps to create awareness, whether you're a writer or a patient or a practitioner. I think it helps you imagine different perspectives.
So, as someone that gets your students once they make it to the healthcare careers of some sort, the thing that I'd like to see when you're teaching these things, good writing is good thinking. And so, one of the things that is very important is when they come to me is that there's sort of two distinct categories. We have the automatons that can regurgitate information, but it's just mindless facts that they're getting A's on tests. And then there are the people that can actually synthesize thoughts, have different perspectives, be able to hold a couple opinions in their head at the same time and feel that's an okay thing and not be offended by it. And that's a very important thing for the long-term practice in medicine.
Yeah, I totally did not pay him to say that to you either. But you should write that. Good writing is good thing. I love that. Perfect. So, using the book in teaching, for me, I mean, this is kind of what I do in classes like medicine and the arts, and we have to have a way in, right? And I think these stories are a great way in. But I think about my colleague in infectious disease, Dr. Kaku, and she runs this group called the Teaching Scholars. And she invites me in like every semester to come and sit with some of the brightest professors in the School of Medicine and other areas in the health sciences to teach them about narrative medicine. And I get an hour at like 8 o'clock in the morning. So it's got to be pithy, and it's got to, you got to kind of get into it and do it. And when I think about some of these, how quickly people can tell such beautiful stories, right? The very first piece in this book is like less than 2 pages, right? But we can have, a vibrant discussion, a little bit of writing, what Rita Sharon calls in the shadow of the text, very quickly. So I think that's like one of the nicest things about having it now, is that when I'm called in to do these things, it's like, it's just, pick it off the shelf. It's go time.
And one of the things, when you're writing a book proposal to send to a press, you have to show how your project is different from what's been, published before. And that was very easy for us because even though there are single topic memoirs, full-length books about a particular condition, we couldn't find any other collections like this that offer such a diversity in the types of writers, but also the types of medical conditions. And so I think that alone offers a lot to students when we're teaching them.
Wait, we got one more question. We have to we got to take Travis's question. He's been so good to us.
You've kind of been talking about the value of narrative medicine from inside and outside the medical field. Do you think that kind of extends to things like the Haddaway after a while? Patients talk about it while they're going through it. And has that, for those of you in the medical field, do you think that has helped you and patients kind of understand what they're going through and connect with it by allowing them to give voice to what they're doing with other people going through it?
Yeah, I think that it does. And it's not just this book. This book just reinforced that fact, but it was the projects I've done sitting with patients with cancer and sitting with patients with HIV, and how engaged the health providers around me are in that process. They want to know the stories. They're interested to see what happens, right? And to me, that's really exciting and hopeful for both patient and provider. So but I'm going to let Matt answer it. I'm pretty much just going to defer to Dr. Smith.
Well, the people get into the healthcare field because we want to connect with people. We want to help people. it's the application of science as an art and being able to help people. And so being able to have these stories and be able to have these personal connections is really important for sort of this two-way relationship, because we do build relationships.
All right, please join me in thanking our panelists. The next Humanities Center event is February 21st. Author Silas House will be reading from his latest novel, Southernmost. This event, I neglected to mention, is funded in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council. We're very grateful for their support. There's a survey that the Humanities Council asks us to fill out. Travis, where is that?
It is out there. I'll be handing them out.
We'll be handing them out. If you can take a minute to fill those out, that we'd really appreciate it. In the meantime, thanks for coming. Safe travels. Thanks a lot.